The ranch hadn't always been silent, but it had always been wild. It stretched across almost 100 acres of uneven terrain in northern Texas, with creeks that rose too fast after storms and mesquite trees that clawed at your windows in the wind. To the south, the hills rolled gently like folded linen sheets. To the north, a tangled line of woods bordered the property, thick with brush and bramble. It was a place for people who didn't want to be found, and Alexis Marshall had no interest in being found. She wasn't running from anything dramatic, at least not by the standards of her own past. Alexis had spent 20 years immersed in research and government contracts, mostly dealing with behavioral science and livestock ecosystems, specializing in stress response mapping in genetically rare breeds. Her work was important, even celebrated in quiet corners of the academic world. She published under initials A.D. Marshall, and most people assumed she was a man. That suited her just fine. She didn't want conferences, awards, or photographs. She wanted data, silence, and respect. The ranch, which she inherited from her mother 3 years ago, was never meant to be permanent. It was supposed to be a fallback, a place to breathe and reset. But as the months dragged on, then years, the world beyond the barbed wire started to feel increasingly fictional. Everything she needed was here, and everything outside felt like a threat. The bulls were a different story. Alexis bred a small herd of federally protected Bos Taurus, descendants of a Spanish line crossed with regional heritage breeds. Hardy, dark-eyed, and smarter than they were given credit for, the bulls were a genetic rarity now. The Federal Conservation Board had declared the bloodline a critical reservoir 4 years ago, and Alexis had agreed to manage a micro-program that maintained breeding integrity. It paid little, but it mattered. The herd was small, only 7 bulls, 3 cows, and 1 calf born that spring, but it was clean, strong, and utterly irreplaceable. She kept them away from commercial operations and didn't allow outside handlers. No tagging, no branding. She believed in surveillance, not intrusion. Every part of the ranch, from the tool shed to the farthest paddock gate, was monitored with heat sensors and infrared triggers. Not because Alexis was paranoid, but because the rest of the world was often reckless. There was no welcome sign at the front gate, just a long, dust-stripped driveway flanked by weather-worn oak and a rusted cattle guard. Visitors didn't come, and if they did, they usually turned back on their own. Alexis didn't belong to the local homeowners' council, a smug little social collective operated by affluent vineyard owners, second-home retirees, and self-appointed land stewards who couldn't tell a heifer from a fence post. They called themselves the Association. She refused to join from day one, not because she had a problem with rules, she was a scientist after all, but because she had a problem with performative order enforced by people who had no idea what they were doing. Karen Stanwyck was one of them. Her property bordered Alexis's ranch on the eastern edge, and her vineyard was a source of mild gossip in the area. Beautifully designed, poorly managed, propped up by her late husband's inheritance and her own sharp tongue. Karen was not someone you could ignore. She had the kind of confidence that came from never being corrected, and the kind of voice that could make a statement sound like an accusation. From the beginning, Karen had made her disapproval clear. Alexis's fences were unsightly, her dogs were too loud, and her bulls, yes, the federally protected, grant-funded bulls, were aggressive and unsafe for the neighborhood. Karen, of course, had no formal agricultural background, but she once said she read an article about cattle behavior in Sunset magazine. That seemed to be enough. For the most part, Alexis had kept their interactions minimal. A nod at the property line, a clipped response to a passive-aggressive letter. She'd received plenty of them, printed in 12-point Times New Roman, always signed, warmly, Karen S., complaining about everything from the visual disruption of Alexis's livestock pen to the distressing presence of wildlife on her side of the creek. Alexis never responded. She didn't need to. The land was zoned for agricultural preservation, and her status as a conservator granted her legal leeway most landowners didn't have. Karen could complain all she wanted, but Alexis was within her rights. Still, there were signs. Over the past few months, Alexis had noticed subtle shifts around the perimeter. Fence lines with new scratches, small flags tucked into corners of the brush as if someone had been scouting. Once, she found tire tracks cutting through a low section of the field where only the cattle and a maintenance cart were allowed. It could have been teenagers, a lost hunter, or someone chasing a deer, but her gut told her otherwise. Nothing had been stolen. No gates were broken, but something was off. Then came the boulder. One morning, Alexis rode her ATV to the North Ridge where she kept a secondary water source, a tank fed by spring runoff. It was a maintenance route, not a pasture. She only went up there once every 2 weeks, and nobody else had reason to. But there, just past the turnoff, someone had placed a mid-sized boulder in the road. It didn't roll there. It was set, intentionally, positioned in the middle of the path like a warning or a marker. Alexis parked, walked around it, and scanned the tree line. Nothing. She noted the placement, photographed it, and added it to her logbook. Strange, but not actionable. That night, she installed a motion-activated trail camera 50 yards from the spot. The next morning, the footage was gone. The SD card had been pulled. No animal could do that. No natural event could explain it. Someone had walked out in the dark, found her camera, and removed the data. Alexis didn't panic, but she did recalibrate. This wasn't just petty surveillance anymore. Someone had been close. Someone knew her rhythms. And then, just before dawn 3 days later, she heard the first gunshot. It wasn't near the house, too far off for that, but it was on her land. Somewhere past the creek, toward the northern fence line. Alexis sat up in bed, breath held, listening. The second shot came 5 minutes later. Then, nothing. She didn't grab a rifle. She didn't call the police. She opened her laptop, noted the time, and messaged her liaison at the Wildlife Conservation Office. Possible poaching on protected acreage. Need response protocol. Coordinates to follow. By 6:12 a.m. she was on her ATV, helmeted, armed only with binoculars, and headed to the far edge of her property. And that's when she saw them. 3 men, none of them familiar, in full camouflage, rifles slung over their shoulders, walking casually along her inner fence line like they belonged there. One of them even stopped to drink from the creek, bending low, unaware or unconcerned that he was on someone else's land. But what made her blood run cold wasn't their gear. It wasn't the rifles. It was the orange marker spray one of them carried, and the bright plastic tags already hammered into the trees on her side of the fence. Survey tags. They weren't just hunting. They were staking something out. And that's when Alexis realized. This wasn't about land usage. This wasn't even about her bulls. This was about territory. And someone, maybe Karen, maybe someone else, had just declared a quiet, deliberate war. The next morning, Alexis didn't start her day with a checklist as she usually did. There was no feeding routine, no quiet coffee on the back steps, no planning out fence inspections or adjusting the timers on the pasture irrigation. Instead, she sat motionless at her desk, her fingers still hovering above the keyboard, replaying the image of those 3 men moving freely through her land. They had walked with the kind of entitlement that couldn't be faked, purposeful, unhurried, completely unbothered by the fact that the property wasn't theirs. That wasn't curiosity. That wasn't a mistake. That was rehearsal. She didn't call the police. Alexis had learned long ago that formal channels were only as effective as the people behind them, and she knew from experience that the local deputy would ask questions in the wrong order and leave before anything meaningful had been done. Instead, she contacted the private security consultant she'd used before, a quiet, precise man named Dalton, who had retired early from something he never specified. Dalton didn't ask questions. He dealt in patterns and probabilities. She sent him the footage from the night before, along with the coordinates, timestamps, and notes about the boulder, the camera theft, and the tire tracks. Within an hour, he responded, "I'll be on site this evening. Low profile. Do not engage directly." At noon, Alexis took a slow drive along the interior boundary, using the old dirt road that looped past the barn, behind the cow pens, and up toward the wooded northern line. She kept the engine quiet, windows down, and noted every change. The spray paint markers were still there, bright orange dots and slashes on 3 trees, spaced evenly, as if part of a surveyor's grid. More disturbingly, she noticed a fresh line of boot prints crossing the shallow creek. The waterline was low this time of year, barely ankle deep, and the mud preserved every impression. Alexis counted 2 different treads, standard hiking boots, possibly military style, and tracked them up the slope where they disappeared into a thicket of cedar and ash. The terrain was too dense for a vehicle. Whoever had been here had come on foot and had known where to cross. She didn't follow, not yet. Instead, she returned to the house and pulled up her topographic overlays. The eastern portion of the property, closest to Karen's vineyard, was relatively flat and accessible, but the northern section, where the trespassers had appeared, was marked by inconsistent elevation, thorn brush, and heavy root systems. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into. You had to choose it, and whoever they were, they had. By 4:00 p.m., Dalton arrived. No one would have known he was there if Alexis hadn't been expecting him. He didn't drive up the main road. He came in from the service access lane behind the pump shed, parked under cover, and walked the rest of the way. She met him at the old smokehouse, which hadn't been used in years but served as a quiet meeting point. Dalton wore plain jeans, a brown work shirt, and a face that didn't attract memory. Alexis appreciated that about him. He greeted her with a nod, took the SD card she'd prepared, and disappeared again without another word. That night, Alexis did something she hadn't done since she moved onto the ranch. She slept with a firearm in reach. It wasn't a theatrical gesture, it was a precaution. Not because she expected a confrontation, but because something inside her had shifted. The land was speaking in warnings now, subtle but insistent, and she had learned to listen. The next day, the official envelope arrived. It wasn't from the state. It wasn't from the Conservation Board. It came from the Regional Land Use Commission, a department she hadn't interacted with in years. Inside was a neatly printed letter, unsigned, with a reference code and a formal inquiry. Notification of proposed adjacent property reclassification. Application submitted by Community Resource Group on behalf of Stanwick Agricultural Cooperative. Alexis read the paragraph 3 times before the words truly registered. Karen had filed a petition to reclassify a portion of the shared boundary zone as multi-use public land. Not just her own property, but land that touched Alexis's northern fence. According to the submission, the reclassification would allow controlled ecological engagement, which included supervised recreational hunting, trail expansion, and wildlife management partnerships. Alexis blinked slowly. It was nonsense, all of it. Her northern boundary wasn't shared. It was recorded and registered, down to the post and rail. The land beyond her fence was part of a dedicated conservation corridor that her family had maintained for 3 generations. And yet here it was, on official letterhead, suggesting that part of her acreage might become a staging ground for guided hunts and vineyard-sponsored eco-events. She didn't call Karen. She didn't send a letter. Instead, she contacted her land use attorney, forwarded the document, and added only 1 line of commentary. "They're escalating." The reply came swiftly. "This application won't pass scrutiny, but it's a signal. They're setting up a narrative. Need to get ahead of it." Alexis closed the email and stared out the window for a long time. The bulls grazed quietly beyond the fence, unconcerned. They trusted the land. trusted her, and she had a responsibility, not just to protect them from bullets or traps, but from politics masquerading as neighborly concern. That evening, she took a long walk along the edge of the creek. The light was fading, soft and orange, and the air smelled of dust and sage. She carried nothing with her, no rifle, no camera, just her own eyes. Near the spot where she'd seen the men, she stopped and crouched. The brush was still bent, still pressed down from where boots had passed. And there, half buried in the dirt near a root cluster, was something new. It was a spent shell casing. .308 caliber. Alexis picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, and smiled grimly. Trespassing was one thing. Bringing in long-range hunting rounds was something else entirely. She returned home and added the casing to a Ziploc bag, labeled it with the date and location, and placed it in the same fireproof box where she kept veterinary records and conservation permits. Later that week, Dalton returned with an update. The men in the footage weren't local. License plate checks showed a rental vehicle registered to a limited partnership in Austin, one connected to a company that specialized in heritage land experiences, a vague, moneyed term often used for exclusive hunting and vineyard tourism on privatized land. Alexis didn't need to be told the rest. Karen wasn't just trying to expand her vineyard. She was trying to turn the surrounding wilderness into a product. And Alexis's ranch, inconveniently situated and legally protected, stood in the way. But even knowing that, even with evidence in hand, Alexis felt a strange sense of stillness settle over her. This wasn't the kind of war fought with bullets or lawsuits. Not yet. This was a war of attrition, a war of symbols and provocations. And she needed to be ready for every inch of it. So she made her next move not with a call or a warning, but with a fence. 3 days later, a crew arrived. Not a security team. Not lawyers. Ranch workers, hired anonymously, who erected a new section of reinforced fencing along the northern boundary. It was taller, layered, and embedded with motion sensors. Nothing dramatic, just quiet reinforcement. And next to it, at precise intervals, she placed signs. No graphics, no colors, just a single line, printed in black on reflective white. Protected Genetic Reserve. Federal oversight in progress. She didn't need them to believe it. She just needed them to hesitate. And as the sun set behind her that night, Alexis stood on the porch with a glass of water and watched the darkness stretch across her land. There were no gunshots, no visitors, no trespassers. But the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Someone, somewhere, was burning brush. And Alexis knew. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The week passed in a deceptively calm rhythm. Alexis filled the time with routine, feeding, monitoring, updating the digital logs on her bull's biometric patterns, conducting soil analysis for the grazing paddocks, but her every motion was weighted with a sense of surveillance. Not paranoia. Observation. Like being the only fixed figure in a slow-moving panorama where every blade of grass could shift under an unseen influence. And yet, nothing happened. The fence remained untouched. The sensors didn't trip. No new footprints appeared along the creek, no shell casings, no flags. But it wasn't peace. It was the inhale before something violent. Alexis could feel it, and so she adjusted. She restructured the grazing schedule, moving the herd's overnight location to the southern field, farther from the vulnerable northern stretch. It was less optimal. Drier soil, less shade, but safer. She updated Dalton with her notes and flagged the vineyard-adjacent camera feeds for real-time alerts. The north was quiet, but the east still had a heartbeat. Karen's property was just over that rise, and though the vineyard rows were neatly arranged, the activity that moved within them wasn't always agricultural. Vineyard trucks rolled out late into the evening, long past normal delivery windows. ATVs came and went along maintenance trails that were supposed to be restricted. Alexis saw it all. She kept logs, dated, documented, time-coded. She didn't confront. She didn't engage. Until they crossed the line. It was Thursday morning when she found the breach. Not a full collapse, just a section of wire along the northeast fence unhooked and carefully laid down. No visible damage, no torn posts or scattered brush, just the wire released and left cleanly across the grass like someone had opened a gate that wasn't meant to exist. Alexis's breath caught. She scanned the area, heart slow, controlled, then dropped to one knee. There were prints again, fresher than the last. 3 distinct treads. One deep and square, possibly steel-toe boots. Another more rounded. The third, lighter, erratic. Not military, not ranch, amateur. This wasn't a coordinated incursion. This was a test. And then she saw it. A strip of white plastic flagging tied to a mesquite branch just inside the fence. Neon, frayed at the edge. No mark, no code. But it didn't need one. It was a marker, a signal, a message to someone, or from someone, saying, "We made it through." Alexis didn't touch it. She pulled out her phone and contacted Dalton, voice steady, clear. Physical breach, northern perimeter. 3 sets of prints, fence wire manually displaced, requesting site sweep ASAP. Dalton's response was immediate. ETA 2 hours. Do not restore wire. Leave all contact points undisturbed. She waited. 2 hours later, a black SUV rolled up the service trail. Dalton stepped out, this time with a second man. Taller, leaner, with a quiet gait that told Alexis everything she needed to know. Not hired muscle, intelligence. Former, at least. They didn't introduce themselves beyond first names. The second man, Jonas, moved ahead without waiting. Alexis showed them the breach, keeping her language precise, her observations professional. They took measurements, scanned the fence line, lifted a partial tread with a gel pad, and marked a shallow indentation in the brush where a pack or cooler might have been set down. When Dalton returned, his tone was grim. "You've got intentional incursion," he said. "Not random. They're not looking for access. They're checking response time, terrain, routes." "For what?" Alexis asked, though she already knew. Dalton didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Alexis initiated Lock Protocol Delta. Not an emergency lockdown, but a tiered escalation system she designed years ago for hypothetical risks. The ranch gates were reinforced with steel crossbars. All exterior cameras were set to stream instead of local storage. Her satellite backup was activated, and she shifted her primary communication server to a low-frequency rural mesh system, a tactic meant to keep data movement invisible to casual surveillance. She wasn't overreacting. She was preparing. The next event came 2 days later, and it wasn't an intruder. It was a bull. Augustus, her largest male, when 1,700 pounds of deliberate muscle and inherited calm, was found limping near the lower paddock at dawn. The injury wasn't immediately visible, but Alexis saw it in his gait, the way his hind leg dragged slightly behind, like a tightened spring unable to fully release. She called in Dr. Keller, her trusted large animal vet. He arrived mid-morning, a quiet man who didn't ask questions and never spoke in absolutes. They tranquilized Augustus and examined him. "Bruising in the rear hock," Keller said. "Some swelling around the joint. Unusual placement." "Blunt trauma?" Alexis asked, eyes narrowing. "Could be." Keller nodded, running gloved fingers over the muscle. "Could also be environmental. Fell, hit something, backed into something under pressure. No fractures, but not natural movement. Not from grazing." "Could it be a trap?" she asked carefully. Keller paused. "Like a snare or a pit?" Alexis didn't answer. "I check your terrain." They kept Augustus under light observation and prescribed anti-inflammatory medication. But Alexis was already working through a mental map of every inch of that paddock. She drove the range that afternoon, walking the edges of the grassland with a field rod. And just before the hill slope curved south, she found it, a depression in the soil. Shallow, irregular, lined with wood. Not a hunter's trap. Not a pitfall. A wedge. Something designed to collapse. She didn't touch it. She called Dalton. By evening, the hole was being photographed, sampled, and recorded under artificial light. Jonas worked without speaking, placing colored flags along the perimeter, marking entry and egress routes. Dalton stood nearby, arms crossed, silent until the work was done. They weren't trying to kill him, he finally said. They were testing reactions, movement, injury recovery, its behavioral manipulation. Alexis stared at him, like stock pressure mapping. Dalton nodded once. Exactly. She turned, walking back toward the ATV, her mind sprinting. This wasn't about the bulls as livestock. It was about the bulls as narrative, as obstacle. If she lost even one, by injury, death, escape, it would give someone the angle they needed. A reason to declare her operation unsafe, her containment practices flawed, her role as guardian compromised. This wasn't poaching, it was framing. The following morning, the first letter from the County Agricultural Review Board arrived. A soft threat, dressed in polite words. Concerns raised regarding enclosure suitability. Reports of unsupervised livestock beyond perimeter bounds. It wasn't a citation. It wasn't even official. But it was the first needle. Alexis scanned the page, then filed it away, knowing exactly who had whispered those concerns into someone's eager ear. Later that day, while refilling mineral stations at the southern end, Alexis saw movement at the eastern tree line. Just a flash of blue and white behind the fence. Not one of hers. Not a rancher. She froze, turned slowly, and raised her binoculars. Karen. Dressed in a flowing blouse and wide-brimmed hat, she stood at the edge of her property, arms folded, watching. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. Just watched, then turned and walked back toward the vineyard. Alexis lowered the binoculars, breath even, mind cold. The battle lines weren't theoretical anymore. They had been drawn, and now they were being crossed. With boots, with traps, with letters. And soon, with something worse. The wind had shifted again. It wasn't something most people would have noticed, but Alexis had trained herself to read patterns long before she ever stepped foot onto the ranch. It was part instinct, part professional residue from years of interpreting behavior in unpredictable systems. The change in the air wasn't just temperature or humidity. It was pressure. Human pressure. Someone nearby had made a decision that would alter the shape of what came next, and it didn't take long to confirm. 3 days after the trap incident with Augustus, Alexis received a certified envelope that bore no return address. Inside was a folded copy of a proposed land use expansion plan. This one filed through a private development firm representing Community Ecological Partnerships. It included a digital rendering of the area surrounding her ranch, marked in colored. Overlays. One section was labeled Open Range Wildlife Corridor. It encompassed her northern pasture, the same land where her bulls grazed and where the trap had been laid. The implication wasn't subtle. Someone was trying to reclassify her terrain without her consent, using environmental buzzwords and bureaucratic sleight of hand to disguise an aggressive land grab as a cooperative conservation effort. The name on the final page, the applicant, wasn't Karen. It was a shell company, managed by a board that included, buried in the filings, a man named Ellis Marston. Alexis knew that name. He was a regional planner, recently retired, and had long been rumored to have personal ties to Karen's late husband's estate. She didn't need a conspiracy board to connect the dots. Alexis scanned the diagrams and found herself staring at the red lines drawn over her map. Someone had sat in a room and traced over her land, believing it could be divided, labeled, rewritten. She imagined their discussions, cool, practiced language about natural integration and land optimization, without once acknowledging the lives already entwined in the soil. Her herd wasn't a concept. Her fences weren't temporary. And her name wasn't just a signature on a property deed. It was history, blood, effort. But in this proposal, she was an obstacle. Nothing more. She didn't call her lawyer this time. Instead, she called Dr. Healy, a federal liaison attached to the Office of Rare Breed of Preservation. Alexis had worked with her during the genetic evaluation period years ago, and while they hadn't spoken in months, there was a professional rapport still intact. When Healy answered, her voice was neutral, brisk. Alexis explained what had happened, the incursion, the injuries, the mapping, and now, this backdoor reclassification effort. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. Just facts, layered in sequence. Healy was quiet for a long beat. Then, "I need to see it." "I thought you only did annuals." "This isn't routine anymore, Alexis. It sounds like someone's trying to manipulate policy through jurisdictional ambiguity. And if protected breeds are being used as leverage, or worse, threatened, we'll intervene." Alexis exhaled slowly, the first real crack in her guarded shell. "You'll come yourself?" "Yes," Healy said. "And I'm bringing an enforcement officer from the Department of Livestock Integrity. They'll want full site access." "When?" 2 days. That night, Alexis didn't sleep. Not from fear, but from calibration. She walked her perimeter twice, checked every sensor, reread every line in the proposal, and prepared documentation. Surveillance logs, injury records, chain of custody notes on the shell casing and snare site. It was exhausting, but methodical. She knew the stakes. If Healy's report found inconsistencies, the intervention might not be protection. It might be scrutiny. And scrutiny could be weaponized if the wrong people got involved. The next morning, as if on cue, Karen appeared again. This time not at the fence, but at the southern gate. She stood outside in her pastel blazer, sunglasses perched like armor, and rang the old bell that hadn't been used in years. Alexis watched her from the window, debated, ignoring her, then chose otherwise. She stepped outside, keeping her expression unreadable. Karen smiled, thin and practiced. "Morning, Alexis. Thought I'd stop by. You've been awfully quiet." "That's the point of a private ranch." Karen laughed lightly, but her eyes didn't shift. "There's been some concern, among the council. All these security people coming and going. Fences going up like prison walls. People are starting to wonder what you're hiding." "Nothing," Alexis said, "and I don't answer to people who wonder instead of ask." Karen nodded slowly. "Still, there's a responsibility that comes with land like yours, the kind that reaches beyond fences and deeds." "I'm aware. That's why it's federally protected." Karen's smile faltered, just slightly. "We all want what's best for the land, Alexis. For the community." "You mean what's best for you?" Karen tilted her head, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed if Alexis hadn't seen it before, an old habit used when testing whether she still held control of a room. "No," she said finally, "but if you keep escalating, don't be surprised if the community escalates in kind." Alexis said nothing. Karen adjusted her sunglasses, turned without another word, and walked back to her car. When Healy arrived 2 days later, she didn't come alone. A white government SUV pulled up behind her, and out stepped Officer Rayner, quiet-eyed and formal, carrying a briefcase instead of a firearm. They walked the property together, inspecting the bulls, reviewing the fencing, and logging entries on the biomonitoring stations Alexis had installed years ago. Healy asked pointed questions about the recent injuries, the breach points, the odd behaviors noted in one of the younger bulls who had begun pacing near the fence at night. Alexis answered without speculation. Then Healy said something that caught her off guard. "We've had other reports. Not from your region, but similar. Isolated properties, rare breeds, coordinated pressures from third parties claiming ecological interests. It's not coincidence. It's extraction disguised as stewardship." Rayner added, "The Enforcement Board is drafting a cautionary protocol. You're not the only target, but you may be the first with enough leverage to push back publicly." Alexis frowned. "Why me?" Healy looked at her directly. "Because you're off the grid, but not off the record. You're clean, funded, and competent. If they can break your perimeter, they can break anyone's." As the sun set behind the barn that evening, Alexis stood with her arms folded, watching the bulls move slowly toward the feeding stations, unaware of the war circling around them. And for the first time, she understood the scale of what was unfolding. It wasn't just Karen. It wasn't just local politics. This was a system being tested, pressure being applied to the right point to see if it would give. But Alexis Marshall had no intention of giving. The arrival of federal agents on her land should have signaled a peak in the tension. Instead, it became the beginning of a deeper descent, one in which the conflict no longer revolved around borders or fences, but perception, narrative, and the erosion of credibility. Alexis had prepared herself for pressure, even retaliation, but she hadn't anticipated how surgical it would feel. There were no broken windows, no late-night gunshots, no direct confrontations. Instead, there were slow leaks, quiet hands moving behind curtains, and the subtle shifting of community tone that suggested someone else, someone more charming, more visible, was telling a different version of her story to anyone who would listen. It began with the calls. At first, Alexis dismissed them. Wrong numbers, hang-ups, rural spam. But then the messages began to change. Someone asked for the woman with the dangerous cattle. Another warned her, half joking, to keep those animals off public land before someone gets hurt. She checked her listings, her registry presence, her privacy settings. Nothing had changed. Yet somehow someone had begun distributing her number. It wasn't on the conservation registry, not on any public-facing agricultural directory. That meant someone local had accessed internal networks or files. It meant someone was laying groundwork. She compiled the voicemails and forwarded them to Dalton, who returned with a clipped message. "Information bleed. Not accidental. Be advised. Someone has an internal." Alexis knew what that meant. Karen, or someone working with her, had made contact with someone in a city office. Not for legal action, at least not yet, but to start injecting doubts into the bureaucratic bloodstream, slow and untraceable. They were building a file, not on her bulls, on her. The next blow didn't come in the form of another trap or a trespasser. It came from the county feed supplier who canceled an order she'd placed months earlier for a specialty grain mixture designed to help stabilize the mineral levels in her bull's diet. The cancellation came with no explanation, just a refund and a blank invoice. When she called to ask why, the manager told her flatly, "We were advised not to fulfill requests related to high-risk livestock. Liability's getting tricky out here." Alexis didn't scream. She didn't argue. She thanked him and hung up. Then she sat at her desk and stared at the spot on her monitor where the order had been logged, and she understood what was happening. She was being starved, not financially, not overtly, but operationally. Death by inconvenience. The bulls noticed before she did. Within days, 2 of the younger males grew irritable, pacing more aggressively, nudging the fence line with agitation. Their diets had been temporarily shifted to a lower protein mix which, while safe in the short term, threw off their behavioral equilibrium. Alexis tried to correct the imbalance through adjusted routines, longer grazing cycles, and increased hydration, but the results were inconsistent. They needed the proper feed, and they needed it soon. She drove 3 towns over and arranged a private deal with a small independent supplier who agreed to sell her a short-term batch in cash. It was a stopgap, nothing more. But on the way back, she noticed the car. It was an older model SUV, maroon with a dented rear panel. It didn't tail her in the traditional sense, no close following, no aggressive speed matching, but it appeared at 3 separate intersections across 30 miles, always a few car lengths behind, never getting too close, never vanishing entirely. At one point, a Lexus pulled into a service station and walked inside. When she came out 10 minutes later, the SUV was parked across the lot, engine idling. No one got out. No one acknowledged her. She got back in her truck, turned sharply, and drove the rest of the way home through a side route that cut through a canyon and emerged south of her property. The SUV didn't follow. She didn't report it. She documented the plate number and sent it to Dalton, who confirmed within the hour. Rental, local, cash transaction, no tracking metadata. It was deliberate and temporary. Someone was watching for patterns. 2 nights later, she was woken by the dogs. They didn't bark at coyotes. They didn't even bark at deer. But at 3:12 a.m., they lost their minds in a way that chilled Alexis to her core. Full-throated, sustained, directional. Not warning, challenge. She threw on her boots, grabbed the long-range flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The pasture was silent. No lights, no motion. But the dogs wouldn't stop. She waited 10 minutes, watching. Then she saw it, brief, low to the ground, just past the second fence line. A flicker of movement, a crouch, someone watching, not advancing, not retreating, just observing. Alexis didn't call out. She didn't fire a warning shot. She turned off the flashlight and went back inside. The next morning, she walked the perimeter and found what she expected: a trail of compacted grass, disturbed soil, and a new flag. This one black, not bright, tied low on the branch of a buckeye tree. It wasn't meant to be seen by daylight. It was meant to be seen at night, from a low vantage, directional signaling, tactical. She removed it, bagged it, logged it. Then she changed tactics. That afternoon, Alexis drove into town, not for supplies, not for meetings, but to visit the local USDA liaison office, where she scheduled an unannounced appointment. She didn't come in with folders or dramatic claims. She brought photos, timestamps, veterinary reports, a copy of the False Land Use Expansion Plan, and a printed list of every confirmed protected specimen in her herd. She laid it all out in front of the compliance officer and said, without emotion, "This is an active interference campaign targeting a federally protected breeding program. I am not seeking litigation. I'm requesting compliance monitoring and independent verification of my containment and ethical stewardship." The man behind the desk blinked. He wasn't used to ranchers speaking like that, especially not ones who looked like Alexis. Dust-worn, steel-eyed, competent. He agreed to initiate a review within 2 weeks. She thanked him and left without ceremony. That night, the retaliation arrived. Not as violence, not as break-in, as a fire. Not large, not destructive, but purposeful. A stack of discarded feed bags near the old tool shed, long since unused, was soaked in accelerant and lit just after midnight. The flames were contained quickly thanks to the gravel perimeter and the distance from any flammable structures. But it wasn't the fire that mattered. It was the choice of location. The tool shed had no cameras. Someone had mapped her blind spots. Dalton arrived the next morning, livid. His team scoured the area, lifted partial prints, gathered ash samples, and extracted a melted piece of lighter casing from the debris. They had no doubt about the cause, but there would be no charges, no arrests, not without more. Alexis didn't argue. She simply widened the surveillance range, doubling her cloud storage feed and installing thermal imaging nodes across the northern field. She no longer assumed that escalation would be linear. It wouldn't be a single big event. It would be attrition, chips, erosion, until something gave. And then it did. Not her fences, not her bulls, her water line. 3 days later, the north irrigation system failed. Not a burst pipe, not a leak, a cut, clean, angled, deliberate. The trench feeding the backup troughs had been sliced and sealed shut with a plug made of compacted clay and gravel, enough to redirect pressure, confuse diagnostics, and make the system appear damaged but not tampered with. Alexis called her technician, who diagnosed the issue but couldn't explain the nature of the cut. "It's surgical," he said, "not vandalism. Someone knew exactly where to hit and how to hide it." By the time the repair was complete, the bulls had gone nearly 20 hours without optimal hydration. One of the younger ones, Barrow, had developed signs of early heat stress. Alexis worked through the night, using cool mist sprays, manual rehydration, and shaded corrals to bring his vitals down. He recovered, but barely. She didn't wait for another letter, another flag, another polite violation. She filed for emergency intervention, through the federal board, through conservation enforcement, through every single department she had access to. She documented every hour, every event, every threat. And then she waited, not passively, not idly. She waited like an apex predator waits, still, cold, patient, because now there would be no warnings, no negotiations. They had reached the second escalation, and the next move would belong to her. Alexis had always believed that silence was more instructive than noise, that when things truly reached the edge of collapse, the air around them would still, and that calmness, real calmness, only existed before a storm that had finally settled on its target. In the days following the waterline sabotage, the ranch descended into that kind of stillness. There were no more anonymous calls, no visible watchers at the tree line, no new flags or fire or trap sites. Even Karen disappeared from view, her house dim in the evening, her vineyard activity reduced to the occasional hum of equipment but no personnel in sight. And still, Alexis didn't relax. She didn't take the calm for surrender. She knew it was exactly the opposite. The pressure had changed shape. It was now administrative, bureaucratic, and, most dangerously, quietly persuasive. People like Karen didn't back down. They changed tactics. If public nuisance and physical harassment hadn't worked, the next play would be systemic, buried inside regulatory hearings, interdepartmental memos, and boardroom whispers about contested compliance and uncooperative landholders. Alexis understood that the game had moved above ground but into invisible rooms, and in those rooms the only language respected was cold, verified, procedural fact. She had spent the past 3 weeks curating that language, compiling incident logs, timestamps, satellite imagery, veterinary documents, even drone footage. Yes, legally operated under the open-range observational clause of her federal conservation permit. The footage had captured 2 unregistered persons stepping over her external fence and moving in a controlled arc along the eastern boundary, pausing near the wellhead for 15 minutes before leaving. No theft, no damage, just presence. Intentional presence. That alone, under new trespass legislation, qualified as a breach of protected agricultural territory. Alexis had sent that footage, along with corroborating sensor data, to 3 separate departments: livestock integrity, environmental compliance, and federal rural enforcement. She didn't make any legal conclusions in her cover letters. She simply submitted the facts. Cold, complete, unemotional, and it worked. The response came faster than she expected. It wasn't an apology, not even a warning letter. It was an unannounced site inspection. On a Wednesday morning, 2 white trucks bearing USDA and DOI logos arrived without notice. Inside were 4 individuals, 2 officers from Rural Compliance Enforcement, 1 conservation observer, and a federal livestock pathologist. They came with digital clipboards, thermal scanners, documentation kits, and an explicit instruction: full access. Alexis didn't blink. She handed them her access codes, maps, documentation, and didn't ask them for details. She didn't need to. Their presence was the detail. The unspoken statement, "We're listening now." For the next 6 hours, they walked the property. They reviewed the bulls, recorded their behavior, examined the fencing, sampled water, tested feed quality, and reviewed surveillance footage. Not just the obvious parts, but the timestamps surrounding every unexplained alarm, every deactivated camera, every audio glitch. The team split into pairs, each covering a section of the ranch as if moving through a crime scene. And in truth, it was a crime scene. Not because something had died, but because something sacred had been violated. The line between private protection and public erosion. That afternoon, as the sun reached its peak and the bulls began their slow movement toward shaded corral spaces, the pathologist requested a secondary examination of Augustus, the injured bull from weeks ago. His limp had mostly disappeared, but his rear joint still bore faint scarring, and his behavioral logs, compiled by Alexis with cold precision, indicated a measurable deviation in movement patterns following the incident. The pathologist compared those logs with biometric data collected via collar sensors and confirmed what Alexis already suspected. Augustus had experienced targeted trauma consistent with a blunt force impact delivered by a human-applied wedge, or pressure barrier, not natural accident or inter-herd aggression. In simpler terms, he had been attacked. That alone might have prompted an internal report, but it was what happened next that made the inspection go from formal procedure to active enforcement. As the team swept the northern edge near the lower grazing corridor, the environmental compliance officer noticed something unusual in the underbrush. Small, rectangular tags, almost imperceptible, affixed to trees with industrial staples. The tags were barely larger than a coin, black with faded yellow lettering, embedded with passive tracking chips. Initially thought to be old survey markers, closer examination revealed something far more sophisticated. Directional field tags often used in controlled hunting zones for tracking animal movement during guided expeditions. Not legal ones. Private ones. Exclusive. The tags weren't hers. Alexis stood absolutely still as the officer turned to her and asked, "Have you authorized any third-party activity in this section?" "No," she said. "Are you aware of any partnerships with recreational land use firms?" "No." "Then, these are unauthorized. You understand what that means?" "I do," Alexis answered, voice steady. What it meant was this. Someone had not only trespassed, but had treated her land as operational staging ground for a hunting enterprise. One that wasn't sanctioned, recorded, or declared. That level of encroachment wasn't petty. It was felony-level bioaggression under the Agricultural Protection Act and Federal Livestock Preservation Law, and the presence of protected bulls on site elevated it to a violation with potential federal charges. The inspectors documented everything, tagged the area, and made quiet calls on encrypted radios. Later that evening, as the trucks departed and the quiet returned, Alexis stood at the edge of the upper paddock and watched the sunset turn the sky the color of iron. She didn't feel victorious. She felt precise. The next move would not be an argument. It would be consequence. And the consequence arrived at Karen's door at 5:44 the next morning. Federal agents. No lights, no sirens, just procedure. Karen was not arrested. That wasn't the purpose of the visit. The agents executed a search order tied to the unauthorized use of geotagged surveillance equipment on protected land. Inside her garage, behind crates of wine shipments and a disused irrigation system, they found a steel case containing directional beacons, mapping data, and 2 printed contracts. one bearing Karen's name and another listing Ellis Marston as the designated regional coordinator for guided legacy hunts. The documents referenced parcels of land not belonging to Karen, but included Alexis's ranch number in the mapping appendix. That alone would have been enough for prosecution. But what truly sealed it was the meat. Vacuum sealed, labeled, frozen. Bull muscle. Genetically tested within 24 hours, the sample matched DNA from a still-living member of Alexis's herd. Not enough to suggest slaughter, but more than enough to prove biological extraction. Someone had taken a sample, possibly during the tranquilization of Augustus, and attempted to move it off-site. The intent was clear. They weren't trying to kill the bulls. They were trying to replicate them, breed them, sell them, privately, and Alexis, her ranch, her work, her silence, had been the barrier in their way. She didn't need to press charges. The Department of Livestock Enforcement initiated proceedings automatically. Karen's licenses were suspended. Her vineyard lost its ecological partnership status. The regional council disavowed her within days. Ellis Marston disappeared from public record entirely, retired again, this time for good. But Alexis didn't celebrate. She didn't tell anyone. She simply updated her log, adjusted her sensors, and moved the herd further west. And one evening, after the dust had finally settled, she installed a new sign at the gate. It didn't threaten, it didn't warn, it simply read, "Preservation is not permission. Trespass is extinction." And then she locked the gate, turned off the porch light, and let the dark take its place again. After the dust of legal filings and enforcement reports settled into the quiet undercurrent of rural bureaucracy, Alexis found herself alone again. But it was not the same solitude that had drawn her to the ranch years before. This silence was not a choice. It was aftermath. The kind that lingered like a pressure behind the ribs, a subtle reminder that even when a war ends, the terrain remembers every movement of its battles. The bulls had returned to their usual rhythm. Their agitation faded, their injuries healed, and the boundaries of the land reasserted not just with fences or permits, but with consequence. But Alexis had changed. Not in some dramatic existential way. There were no grand revelations or monologues. The change was in her posture, in the way she scanned the tree line, the way her hands hesitated a beat longer when opening the feed storage, the way she now left a weatherproof camera aimed not just at the pastures, but at the sky itself. Not because she feared the return of Karen, or Marston, or their shadows, but because she had learned that people do not need access to your land to harm it. They only need access to the idea of it. Karen's property was quiet now. The vineyard had gone dormant under the weight of fines, suspended operations, and public scrutiny. No harvest, no tours, no trucks. Occasionally a vehicle arrived, likely legal counsel or real estate agents, but it never stayed long. The house lights rarely turned on. Some said Karen had left town. Others claimed she was still there, hiding behind drawn curtains, refusing to concede, waiting for the legal machine to find some technicality to reverse her losses. Alexis didn't care. Whether Karen was watching or not no longer mattered. The threat she represented had been neutralized, not just by law, but by exposure. The illusion of respectable stewardship had collapsed, and with it, the weapon she valued most, credibility. Alexis resumed her work slowly, not out of fear, but from precision. Every protocol was reviewed, every log updated, and every measure of genetic and behavioral data triple-checked. She expanded the surveillance buffer, added a secondary solar backup system, and quietly signed a renewed 5-year agreement with the Office of Rare Breed Preservation, this time with a stipulation: should any future breach occur, enforcement. Response would not require additional filing. Authorization would be pre-approved. That was her insurance policy, not against Karen specifically, but against the kind of erosion that pretends to be harmless until it has already taken root. It was in this period of quiet consolidation that Alexis received an unmarked envelope in the mail. No return address, no postmark, hand-delivered. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, slightly warped, of a bull. Not one of hers. A generic, unbranded animal. But something about it, its posture, its eyes, the angle of the head, was meant to echo her own animal's. There was no message, no name, just a thin line of handwriting on the back. You don't own nature. You just borrow it. Alexis stared at it for a long moment, then folded it once and placed it in the burn canister by the shed. She didn't call anyone. She didn't report it. That note wasn't a threat. It was a confession. Someone, somewhere, still believed they had the right to frame the land in their own image. But they had already lost the ground to do it. Spring came early that year. The grass rose thick and high. The bulls moved with relaxed precision, their patterns returning to baseline. Barrow, the younger bull who had come closest to heat collapse, had gained weight, his coat thick and reflective, his temperament measured. He was no longer pacing. He stood often now at the edge of the western field, watching the sun dip low over the ridge, motionless and alert. Alexis sometimes stood beside him, not speaking, not touching, just watching. There was a kind of understanding between them now, the shared memory of something nearly lost, and the quiet resolve of survival not won through luck, but calculation. In early May, Alexis received one final letter, this one official from the Regional Council. It informed her that the contested land use proposal filed by the Shell Corporation had been permanently voided, citing criminal interference, ethical violations, and misrepresentation of territory. The reclassification application would be purged from county records, and any future attempts tied to that name or its affiliates would be flagged and denied. Alexis read the letter, folded it, and placed it in her top drawer, next to the original conservation deed signed by her mother decades earlier. The land was secure. For now. But security wasn't the same as peace. Alexis didn't expect peace anymore. She expected patterns, waves, rotations of threat and calm, each feeding the next. The price of protecting something rare wasn't constant violence. It was constant vigilance. And she was prepared. Not armored, not hardened, just aware. And awareness, she had learned, was its own form of strength. As dusk settled across the ranch that evening, Alexis stood once more at the gate, watching the bulls ease into their evening circuit. Beyond them, in the distance, the line of trees stood silent, the fences unbroken, the sky wide and indifferent. And in that stillness, she smiled. Not from relief, from certainty.